He smirked when I walked away, until he read my last letter. 3 years felt like a single continuous audition. I arrived before the office lights were on, and left after they clicked off, learned how to untangle payroll discrepancies at midnight, and memorized the names and temperaments of every client who ever trusted us with an invoice. I had a wall of certificates that said Employee of the Quarter, and a drawer full of expense receipts that told the quiet truth. I had invested myself, time, sweat, weekends, in building something that ran because I insisted it would. So, when Arthur Alden called a meeting to announce the new regional director, I walked into that glass-walled conference room thinking the applause would be for me. I had been promised. I had been patient. I had rehearsed a simple professional acceptance speech in the mirror more times than I cared to admit. My tie was straight, my chain of metrics was ironclad, and I had, in private, already imagined the nameplate that would sit where mine had been. Regional Director, Amy Hayes. Instead, the table clapped for Lily. Arthur stood at the head of the room with that particular ease men like him perfected over decades. A measured smile, a hand that moved as if to gather applause. He spoke of fresh energy and new perspectives, and then said Lily Monroe's name like it was a new promise. She is his niece. She had been at Alden Ventures for 8 weeks. The sound of the room was like an ocean breaking. It hit me in waves. Surprise, the mechanical enthusiasm of people who applaud because they are supposed to, the half-whispered congratulations that sound like tiny knives. I remember my hands on the sides of my chair, feeling the varnished wood under my palms as if it might anchor me. I remember clapping because the body does what society trains it to do. My face smiled, but my smile felt like a borrowed thing. Everyone looked at me, some with sympathy, some with the careful avoidance of those who don't want to be drawn into family politics. Joseph's look from across the table, he sat beside me, that small island of warm browns and quiet fidelity, said what words could not. I'm sorry. He squeezed my knee under the table the way he always did when he wanted to say more than the meeting allowed. Arthur's eyes crossed mine for a second, polite, almost congratulatory, as he nodded toward Lily. We're lucky to have her, he said, which would have been fine if it hadn't been the same man who'd told me, months before, that this region needs steady hands, and that my name would be the one to steady them. Lily smiled with practiced ease, her new title settling across the room like a smell you can't scrub from a coat. She was polite and bright-eyed, asking sane, naive questions about accounts she hadn't yet managed, jokes about learning from the best, while my brain catalogued the pace of her voice, the way she held a pen, the shoes she wore. Each small detail felt like a ledger entry, invested energy versus received recognition. When the applause reached me, it did not land. It passed like a draft. I clapped because I always had, because the habit was easier than a confrontation. My palms were dry, my stomach wrapped itself tight. That evening, dinner at home could have been an extension of the meeting, words said with gentleness to not reopen the room. Joseph was furious, not performative, but the slow, private anger of someone who sees an injustice and knows that the person they love will bear the price for a while. He wanted to storm, to call names, to make Arthur see the mess he'd made. I wanted none of that. The humiliation at work needed no added spectacle. It needed a response that would preserve me. You don't have to do anything right now, Joseph said, watching me over his fork, but you should know I'm on your side. I know, I said. The truth was, I didn't want his anger to become mine. Anger is hot and quick. It can scorch. I had spent too many nights awake charting client numbers and building processes to let a single outburst undo a reputation I'd been shaping for years. This was not the time for fireworks. It was the time for clarity. A week became 2. Lily shadowed me like a new intern with a full-time badge. She asked the questions everyone assumed she should. She accepted the handed tasks with an almost performative curiosity. Arthur circulated around us with that same patrician smile, praising Lily for her initiative, and then turning to me with a hand that sounded like an offer. Support her. Bring her up to speed. Support her. The phrasing was polite, almost fatherly, but the underside was a veto. I was made the instrument of my own obsolescence. I taught her how to mend a strained account, sat through her client calls where she let me do the heavy lifting, and I corrected the mistakes she made in the reports she'd file in my name. Coworkers watched and learned to say, in quiet tones, "She's dependable." That word, dependable, settled on me like a label. Dependable is respectful. But dependable is not always visible. Dependable is often invisible because it smooths the path for others. In the break room, under the hum of the fluorescent lights and the low whirl of a coffee machine, I overheard the conversation I had suspected but had not yet heard aloud. Arthur's voice carried, rich and casual, the way he owned sound like another asset. "She's been predictable," he said, and the room condensed. "Dependable," Lily agreed, laughing the small laugh of someone discovering, with a blush, her new territory. "She's steady. She doesn't ask for more. She knows her place." It was the surgical clearness of that phrase, "she knows her place," that finished the shaping of a feeling I had tried to name for 2 weeks. Betrayal is not always brutal. Sometimes it is 1,000 small dismissals that together outline your invisibility. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, and I made a list, not of grievances, but of facts. Years worked, projects led, clients retained, crises averted. I wrote down the precise dates of landmark accounts. I put in numbers, because numbers have no favor. They simply are. The ledger was cold and healing. It reminded me that what I had built did not need validation from patronage. The decision to leave did not feel like an eruption. It felt like setting a clean boundary. I thought, with a steadiness I half wondered at, of dignity. Not as a showy thing, but as a refusal. I would not take a role in which my value was a courtesy to someone else's family narrative. I would not spend my life waiting on the mercy of a smile. I drafted the letter twice. The first version was long, almost novelistic, tempted by the rush of everything I'd held inside. I circled phrases, crossed out lines that read as bitter, and eventually settled on a document that did what it had to do. It informed. It did not accuse. It closed a chapter without dragging mud behind it. It was simple. Please accept this letter as formal notice of my resignation from my role at Alden Ventures, effective 2 weeks from today. I am grateful for the opportunities I have had here. I will work to ensure an orderly transition. Thank you for the professional development and the relationships I have built while at the company. I signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and my hand shook only once as I slid the flap closed. There was power in that single trembling, a recognition that I was stepping off a ledge I had built with my own hands, into air that was not yet mapped. I placed the envelope by my purse and drove to work, feeling a peculiar calm, as if I'd stepped outside of the immediate timeline and could see the whole room as a painting. The office on weekday mornings has a particular rhythm. The vending machines, the hum of printers warming up, the muted conversations over spreadsheets. Mine felt like any other day until the moment I walked into Arthur's office. His door was open, and he looked up from his computer as if he trusted that nothing disruptive would happen inside his walls. Marie, his longtime secretary, was at the desk, sorting his calendar with the practiced hands of someone who loves the world ordered. "I need a minute," I said, closing the door softly behind me. I placed the envelope on his desk like I was setting a pebble on water, waiting to see the ripple. Arthur glanced at the envelope, at my posture. He raised an eyebrow, a polite question, a small, assessing movement. And then, in almost the same breath he used to praise Lily, he opened the flap. He read the first line, then the second. For a moment his face was a study in curiosity, like someone who had encountered an unfamiliar pastry and was deciding whether to take a bite. Then a flicker of confusion. Then denial. His eyes narrowed, and I felt the room cool as if the temperature had dropped. "You're resigning?" he asked, incredulous, as if the concept itself was an insult to the architecture of his office. "Why would you—" "I've given this the consideration it deserves," I said, keeping my voice even. "I intend to ensure a smooth handoff in the next 2 weeks." He laughed in the way men like him do, short, dismissive, a sound that tries to make reality bend. "We spoke about this. We had plans for you." He looked up at me with something that wanted to be paternal, and instead came off as startled entitlement. "You can't just—" I did not explain. There are conversations that benefit from being precise, and conversations that only drag you into another person's narrative. I took a small breath and said precisely what I had practiced. "I want to work somewhere that values my contributions and offers growth that is aligned with merit, not family ties." For a second his face was carefully impassive. Then curiosity shifted into offense. He began to speak faster, the cadence of his sentences tripping over anger. "You're making a mistake. We can talk about this. Lily is new, but she has great potential. We need continuity, and you know the accounts. You're making a rash decision." "I'm making a deliberate one," I replied. The phrase had the calm authority of someone who had rehearsed not what to say, but how to be when saying it. I felt at once like a leader and a child, both standing on a line. "I'll stay for 2 weeks to transition." Arthur's initial attempt at containment, patronizing, placating, crumbled. His lips thinned. His hand, which had been flat on the desk, tapped once, twice, a rapid staccato that sounded like a metronome out of rhythm. His eyes flashed, and I watched a man lose the frame he had always used to hold his world together. The slow, armored politeness vanished. He leaned forward, and his voice, which had been used to setting policy, leapt into a personal register I had not heard him use with me before. Small, sharp, as if the room had become smaller and the air thicker. "You can't walk into my office and hand me a resignation as if this is a game," he said. "This is a business. People depend on decisions. We don't do rash things here. Nor do we treat people as placeholders," I said. The words cut through the veneer. They were not angry. They were clean. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. For a heartbeat I thought he might shout, or call security, or do something grand to reassert his command. Instead, his face folded into a kind of disbelief that has only one remedy: to make an example. "You'll hurt the team," he said. "You'll hurt yourself." "And I won't compromise my career to be someone's convenient option," I answered. I heard my voice in the room like a chord that had been tuned. It surprised me how steady I felt, how light the sensation of saying my truth was. It didn't erase the years. It didn't make the wound antiseptic. It simply clarified where I would stand from that day forward. At that, Arthur made a small, almost animal sound, half laugh, half sneer, and then he smirked. It is a particular smirk, one I know well, the kind of expression practiced by people who believe power will outlast any uncomfortable moment. It said, without words, that my choice was dramatic, and that he would weather it precisely because he had weathered more. He folded his arms as if to signal the meeting was over, and I felt for a moment an embarrassed adolescent urge to stamp the finality of my decision with a retort. Instead, I did what I had rehearsed in the mirror. I thanked him for the opportunities, quietly, and left his office with the soft click of the door behind me. I walked down the hallway and past colleagues whose eyes flicked up and then away. Some stared openly, some avoided my gaze as if I had broken something fragile between us. When I reached my desk, I found Margaret waiting, a small worry on her face that had nothing of gossip and everything of concern. "Are you—" she began. "Yes," I said. I resigned. The reaction was as varied as people are. Some were shocked. Some nodded in a way that felt like relief. Tom, who had worked in accounting for longer than either of us could remember, gave me a slow, solemn clap that felt like an old ritual, the kind your community reserves for rites of passage. Marie, who'd seen Arthur through 5 major restructures, looked stricken and then strangely relieved, as if someone had finally spoken aloud what many felt. There were immediate pragmatic ripples. People whispered about the accounts I managed. "Who will handle Morrison Industries?" someone asked. Daniel Morrison was our largest client in the region, complex, exacting, and he trusted the team because he trusted me. The thought of that relationship changing made my chest tighten, not with fear of loss, but with a practical concern. Clients are people, and when your contact leaves, continuity matters. By noon, the rumor mill had started. Some assumed I had been pushed. Others assumed I was leaving for greener pastures. No one had the whole story. No one knew the conversations I'd had in my kitchen or the list of numbers pinned to my notepad, the ledger of work that had convinced me to choose dignity over dependence. Joseph met me for lunch. He had taken the day off, which is the sort of small, unspoken kindness that becomes a life raft. He wrapped his coat around me as we stepped into the chilly street, and I felt the thin, steady warmth of his hand on the small of my back. "You did what you needed to do," he said, not as consolation, but simply as fact. "I left them the necessary time to fill the gap," I said. That, too, was a truth. 2 weeks is professional practice. It's also strategic. It tells an employer, without melodrama, that you can leave without breaking their operation. It leaves the moral high ground intact. Walking from our corner table back to the office felt like stepping across a terrain. People I had passed daily in the lobby now avoided meeting my eye. A few offered soft applause. One of the junior staffers, someone I'd mentored early on, slipped me a Post-it note with 3 names and a scrawled, "Call me if you need help." Small kindnesses gather. That evening, messages began to appear. "Are you okay? Let's talk. We need you." They arrived in a pattern: affection, fear, calculation. Many had anxiety for the accounts because they were loyal to me. Others worried for their own positions, sensing that ripples like this sometimes herald larger personality-driven decisions upstream. The next morning, the office felt different. There was a distinct current of speculation beneath the coffee machine's hum. Arthur avoided my gaze in the hall, but his steps were deliberate, a man attempting to reclaim his narrative by his walk alone. He had not called security. He had not accused me. He had instead chosen to rely on what he trusted most: appearance and control. And then the email landed. It wasn't from Arthur. It was from him, with the world in the subject line: internal memo, staffing adjustments. The message contained the corporate language companies favor when they want distance from human consequences: efficiencies, market recalibration, realignment of resources. It spoke in percentages and timelines, and in smaller type, a list of roles being evaluated. The room's chatter swelled. People read the memo and then looked up as if to ask whether the world was still the same planet. I felt a cold spiral. Not immediate panic, but a quiet calculation. If a resignation creates an imbalance, what casualties might follow? I remembered Arthur's words, that you cannot make a personal decision without also considering the team. He was right, in the sense that choices have consequences beyond the individual. That did not make my decision wrong. It only made it weighty. Margaret stopped by my desk, papers clutched like an anchor. "If anything happens, you helped set me up with the Anderson account last year," she said hurriedly. "I can try to bridge some of this if it comes to that." Her gratitude was genuine. The fact that my work had created bridges for others complicated the moral ledger. Victory isn't measured only by the fall of one structure. My leaving might expose colleagues to risk. It might also be the trigger for conversations that had been postponed for years. Sometimes the mortar between bricks cracks when exposed to heat, and masonry must be rebuilt stronger. Arthur called an all-hands that afternoon. When he stood at the podium, The room quieted as if awaiting the dropping of a curtain. He spoke about strategic direction and necessary adjustments, flattening the complexity of real human lives into a script that resembled a quarterly report. He did not mention my name. He didn't have to. Leaving things unsaid can be more brutal than accusation. It fills the space with 1,000 possible stories people will tell themselves. After the meeting, as people drifted toward the elevators, Marie intercepted me. "He's worried," she said quietly. "He says the Morrison account needs stability." Her voice held a careful softness. Loyalty to her boss, yes, but also a care for the team. By late afternoon, there were messages from clients, polite, measured, a few with the tone of someone checking on the health of a business relationship. Daniel Morrison's assistant asked if there could be a call to discuss continuity. I scheduled it. I would not leave things to chance. Leaving with dignity included owning the work I had done. That night, Joseph and I sat on our couch, the house quiet except for the small sounds of laundry tumbling. I found myself turning over a single scene in my head with the clarity of a film freeze frame. Arthur opening the envelope, his face changing as he read. The smirk, the way he had leaned back in his chair after reading, as if he had been watching a small private film and decided he liked the ending. "I didn't expect him to react like that," Joseph said finally. Smirking? Did he really smirk? "He did," I said. The word was odd and small in the living room, but it carried all the years behind it. The casual diminishment, the expectation that I would accept the role he carved for me. For a moment, he thought he had dismissed me entirely by the way he spoke to Lily. The smirk was a man reminding himself that he could dictate the story. "And now?" Joseph asked. "He'll have to reconcile the story with the letter," I replied. I could see the future like a folded map with one road darkened. The letter, while short, would be a hinge. I had written it to be unassailable. No accusations, only facts and notice. In the curious economy of corporate life, a signed letter is a public statement. It could be filed, forwarded, and misread. It could also be read and felt the way I meant it to be, a clean closing. I slept poorly. In the morning, the office newsfeed had an item that made my stomach drop. A short internal note that Arthur had scheduled a meeting with the board to discuss leadership continuity, and that all department heads were to prepare reports. The language was neutral, but the subtext was obvious. People began to tighten in ways I recognized as the early signs of restructuring. Less laughter in the break room, fewer after-work drinks, more solitary lunches. 2 days later, at exactly 1 minute past 10, Arthur called me into his office again. Marie was not at her desk. She said she had a dentist appointment, though I suspected she had been given the assignment to be elsewhere while a performance was mounted. Arthur shut his door, and I felt once more the architecture of power take shape around us. He read the letter again, slowly this time, as if with the care one might use to read the fine print on a contract. His jaw moved. He folded the paper and unfolded it like someone trying to find a hidden clause. "You know," he said slowly, "there are consequences to leaving." "I understand," I said. "You walked away at the wrong time," he continued. "We're in the middle of a transition. Maybe reconsider. I can speak to the board. We can adjust things." His attempt to negotiate felt like a testing of boundaries. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that he could place me back where convenience favored him. The smirk returned as if habit, but it was thinner now, like a smile stretched. I put my hand on the envelope of resignation in my bag, not wanting to take it out and show him that it was not a bluff. He was not trying to bargain in good faith. He was trying to rewrite the scene so that his authority remained intact, and my departure could be absorbed into a narrative where he still decided the ending. "This isn't about timing for you," I said. "It's about how we value people. I've been told I'm dependable. I'm grateful for the experiences here, but I won't be someone's placeholder." He opened his mouth, and for a breath I expected the old script of patronizing counsel. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, and then did something I had not quite expected from the man I thought I knew. He lost his composure. It was not the theatrical rage of a movie villain. It was a human unraveling. His face flushed. He leaned forward, palms flat on his desk, fingers spread as if trying to hold himself together. "Do you know what this will do to the numbers?" he asked. It was not passion that animated him now, but fear, the fear of a ledger that might tilt against him. "I know there will be impact," I said, "and I will help where I can in the next 2 weeks." "You think the board won't notice?" His voice rose then, edged with something like panic. "I think the board notices patterns," I answered. "I think they notice people who build stability and people who build theatrics. My decision is about where I can do my best work and feel I am respected for it." For a moment, the two of us were in a strange rapport, him offering the language of metrics, me replying with the language of people. He had the instincts of someone who measured the world in balance sheets. I had the instincts of someone who knew that the bottom line is sometimes people, clients, colleagues, counted in relationships rather than spreadsheets. He folded the paper again and set it aside. The smirk I had seen previously was gone. In its place, a darker, more concentrated expression that suggested calculation rather than dismissal. He reached for his phone as if to place a call that would change the scene. "You'll regret this," he said finally, with a tone meant to sound like prophecy and to lock down my doubt. "I'll live with the consequences," I replied. His hand closed on the phone. For a moment I felt the old dynamic, the raw power of a man used to dictating movement from the center. But the line had shifted. There were more players now, clients who had built relationships with me personally, colleagues who knew my work, a wider market that sometimes listens to competence regardless of lineage. He stood then, and for the first time during our conversation, he looked small in his doorway. Not humiliated, no, not yet, but revealed as someone whose authority can be challenged not by spectacle, but by a quiet act of choosing oneself. He said nothing more and watched me leave his office. He did not smirk as I closed the door. Instead, he watched the door as if it might swing open again like the next act of a play. Walking back to my desk, people's heads turned. Some faces were resolute, others anxious. I did not know how many would stand with me or how many would be swept into the next wave of adjustments Arthur's memo might prompt. But I had done what I set out to do. I had removed myself from a structure that had decided my best role was to be invisible. That night, at home, Joseph placed a small glass of whiskey on the table between us. We did not need to overlay the evening with grand statements. The spaces in our sentences were comfortable, like rooms we shared. "You could have stayed," he said, choosing his words. "You could have made more concessions." "I could have," I agreed. "But concessions carve out what's left of you." He reached across and took my hand. "I'm proud of you." Those words were a balm that had nothing to do with the office and everything to do with being seen. They balanced the ledger in a way paperwork cannot. And yet, even with that, the world had teeth. The next morning, I arrived to learn that a client we had been courting, someone with a reputation for shifting loyalty as easily as the wind, had sent a terse note to Marie about re-evaluating their partnership. Rumors added meaning. In small, quick calculations, people were deciding futures. It is strange how a single letter can act as a wedge. It creates a space where possibilities proliferate. It also creates vulnerability, my own, and the shared vulnerability of people who depend on the stability I had provided. I thought of Margaret and Tom and others who might be affected. Responsibility does not disappear because you step away. It changes shape. Alden Ventures, for its part, started to close ranks. Meetings multiplied. Arthur convened an emergency session that was less emergency and more the mechanics of damage control. Lists, mandates, timelines. He spoke of continuity plans and client outreach, But under the corporate phrases, I heard a quieter arithmetic of reputation. I sat at my desk and waited. Waiting is not a passive state in corporate life. It is the accumulation of small decisions you make while the world catches up. I answered emails, prepared handover notes, and met with people who asked the same question with different inflections. Will you stay longer? Will you reconsider? Are you sure? Each time I repeated the same quiet truth. I had made a deliberate choice. I would honor my notice. I would help where I could. I would not be pulled back into a story that reduced my contribution to a courtesy. 2 days before my notice period ended, I found an envelope on my desk without a name. Inside was a printed note, short and simple. Congratulations on your new path. The note had no signature. It could have been from anyone, someone I'd mentored, an executive from another branch who'd heard, a client who respected my decision. Whoever it was, whoever left the note on my desk, I felt the warmth of an unseen ally. That night, before I left, I walked down the corridor to Arthur's office. Marie was at her desk, looking preoccupied as ever, organizing things that suddenly seemed more fragile. Arthur's door was ajar. He looked up when he saw me. "Lock the door if you're having this conversation," he said, the attempt at levity thin. "I don't want to make a scene," I said, "but I thought it right to let you know I appreciate the chance to work here." "You'll come back," he said then, the old smirk trying to reassert itself but faltering. It was almost tender in its possessiveness, like someone who is used to objects returning to him after they've been borrowed. "I won't," I said. That phrase is funny in corporate life. It sounds absolute and cold, but it was simply true. Some doors, once closed, are not about knocking so much as finding another entrance that aligns with who you have become. He watched me leave. I walked down the hallway, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the unfettered possibility of an exit, not as loss, but as option. The smirk had been his instrument. The letter was my instrument. One was reactive, the other was declarative. Outside in the cool air, I breathed and felt the future gather like weather, uncertain, vast, and in its gathering, oddly promising. If you value stories about workplace dignity and choices that honor the person behind the professional, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one that remind us dignity matters. That night, I folded the resignation letter and placed a copy inside a small file labeled Transitions. I set it beside the receipts and certificates that had been my life at Alden. The envelope felt heavier in its finality, and yet lighter in the knowledge that I had chosen it. The days that followed were an intricate choreography of handovers and client calls. I sat across the table from Daniel Morrison on a video call, looked him in the eye, and explained the plan that would preserve his account. He listened with the attentive, guarded interest of a person who trusts results more than names. "Amy," he said at the end, "we want continuity. Whoever leads this region needs your fingerprints on the work. I'll be in touch." There is a particular satisfaction in preserving trust. It is not the same as revenge. It is the quieter victory of competence. It is the firm action in the face of casual dismissal. The morning I put the final handover in Marie's lap, there was a soft tension in the air, the kind that presages change. Arthur kept his distance at the edge of the staff room. He watched everyone, cataloging. His expression was unreadable for a long moment. Later that day, as the sun slanted low through the blinds and painted the lobby in stripes, I walked out the front door of Alden Ventures, carrying the small box of personal items every departing employee collects. A coffee mug with a chipped handle, a picture in a frame of a team's holiday party, the little crystal paperweight that had somehow become a talisman. I slid my bag over my shoulder and felt, undeniably, the heft of leaving. He smirked when I walked away. I felt the smirk like a small bruise, but it did not define me. Not then, not yet. The smirk was his response to my act of assertion. It presumed that he could mend the scene with attitude. It presumed I would shrink back. I held my head straight and walked into the afternoon light, and for the first time in years, I was heading where I had not fully decided to go. The last letter sat inside a file in his office, and he had read it. How he would respond beyond a smirk was a question that would take days to answer. That evening, at home, Joseph and I sat in the dark with a single lamp throwing a small pool of light over the coffee table. I told him about the way Arthur's face had changed when he read the letter, the brief flicker that started curiosity and ended in anger. I told him about the memo and the whispering hallways. I told him about the client calls and the note on my desk. He listened, like someone cataloging evidence for a future case. "We have to be ready," he said quietly. "We are ready," I replied, and the certainty in my voice surprised me. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. I did not know which clients would leave, which colleagues would be swept into changes. I did not know whether Arthur's smirk would turn to a plan to win me back, or to something louder. I only knew that I had drawn a line and that the letter I had placed on his desk had the effect I intended. It made something official. When he opened it, his composure slipped. That was a real moment, a small victory of clarity. He had expected me to be pliable. He had expected the narrative to fit his frame. But he had read the letter, and for the first time he had to reckon with a document that did not fit in any frame he had prepared. Documents are stubborn things. They linger in inboxes and on desks, and in HR files long after words have been said. There are quiet consequences that follow such acts. A client reevaluates, a colleague rethinks their own tolerance, a manager learns that the people beneath him have limits. The world begins to rearrange itself in subtle drafts, and in those drafts I sensed both risk and possibility. The next day, an internal email from Arthur requested a private meeting. Marie added it to my calendar with a pen's small scratch. I sat with the calendar open and felt the hour approach like a tide. I walked into his office and he was there, sitting, a different posture than before, less the facile smirk, more a tightness around the mouth that suggested calculation. The envelope with my resignation lay on his desk like a witness. He looked at me, and for a breath there was a showdown that could have run many directions. He could have tried to publicly coerce me. He could have offered me anything to keep me. He could have ignored the letter. Instead, he rose, walked around his desk, and in the motion of crossing the room, he chose a new register. He decided to threaten with consequence rather than charm with promise. "You'll see," he said low. "This will complicate things for you." I looked at him without flinching. "It will complicate things for them, too," I said, "but I made my choice." He pulled the letter toward him, smoothed it, and then, with a precision that belonged to men who had made their careers on appearances, he picked up the phone. I could tell by his fingers that. You could tell by his fingers that he was dialing for damage control, the kind of call that tries to reframe consequences into calculated adjustments. He spoke into the phone with a voice I'd heard before, the same cadence that convinced a board minutes could be smoothed, and numbers could be bent by rhetoric. I stood there and listened to the syllables he chose, the pauses he left like traps. He said, "We'll issue a statement," and I watched him choose language as if words could stitch whatever had been undone. He hung up and looked at me with a sort of thin patience. "You'll regret this," he said again, as if repetition could make prophecy truer. His attempt to intimidate had become familiar. I'd expected it. What I didn't expect, at that moment, was a call that would come to me instead of to him. My phone vibrated like a small, insistent beetle in my bag. The caller ID read, Rebecca Chin, Horizon Tech. I took the call in the lobby because the sunlight felt less dense than the air inside Arthur's office. Rebecca's voice was brisk and clear, the tone of someone who had been briefed and decided quickly. "Ms. Hayes?" she asked. "I'm Rebecca. I work with Horizon's executive search. I'll be quick. Our CEO has been following your work. Would you be open to a conversation?" I told her I was in transition and asked her to speak plainly. She did. Horizon wanted someone exactly like me, someone who could land big accounts and translate operational rigor into growth. She mentioned Marcus Williams by name, the kind of CEO who read the industry trade journals and attended the same functions as our clients. Her offer was not a promise of immediate headlines. It was an invitation, a senior role with responsibility across the region, compensation that acknowledged my experience, and autonomy over a team that valued retention as much as acquisition. It would have been easier to refuse then and there, to say I had already resigned and that my remaining weeks were devoted to handover. There was a temptation to keep the moment simple and unambiguous. Instead, I listened and asked the questions that mattered to me. What would my mandate be? Who would I answer to? What was their plan for client continuity? Rebecca answered each one precisely, sending a warmth that was both professional and, strangely, human. The interview with Marcus was scheduled within days. It was the kind of conversation that makes you aware of how much your self-definition has been tied to a company name. Marcus asked about Daniel Morrison, of all things. He didn't ask as a journalist might. He asked because he knew an account like Morrison's was a bellwether. "I read your reports," Marcus said, "and I heard you on the Anderson call. I'll be honest, people like you don't come across as often as boards would like. Would you consider coming here to lead the region?" I thought about my notice period, about the people I would leave and the work I still owed them. I thought about dignity and about the ledger I had written on a legal pad in my kitchen. I thought about Joseph, whose quiet steadiness had been a steady current beneath months of turmoil. But there was also a forward pull, a possibility of leading a team where promotion wasn't family currency. I accepted. The transition to Horizon Tech was a relief in small, practical ways. The onboarding paperwork humming through more efficiently than I expected. The conference calls that began with clear agendas instead of performative praise. The office space had light. The coffee was passable. The org chart was not cobbled together to accommodate a surname. Sarah Martinez, a senior manager who would become my right hand, greeted me with an ease that felt like a homecoming. My first test was Daniel Morrison. He was a pragmatist. He valued results above almost everything. I called him on the cusp of my last week at Alden, honest about timelines and explicit about continuity plans, and then told him my new role at Horizon. He listened. I expected questions. Instead, he said quietly, "If you're moving and you're building something I can work with, I'll follow where trust goes." That sentence, simple, businesslike, felt like a key turning in a lock. It was not a dramatic act of loyalty as much as it was an affirmation of the work I'd done. Relationship capital, earned in meetings and late nights and precise deliverables. When I told Arthur that Morrison had received our plan and that the client wanted continuity, he made a small sound at the edge of contempt. "You shouldn't put clients in positions of choosing," he muttered. "They are numbers, not people. But clients are people. They call you when things break, and they stay with you when you keep your promises." Over the next weeks, I worked to preserve more than accounts. I worked to preserve professional ties. I reached out, in careful, respectful notes, to a handful of people with whom I'd built long-term relationships. I told them the facts: my resignation from Alden, my new role at Horizon, and the concrete plan for preserving continuity. I emphasized that the goal was stability for them, not spectacle. Those letters were short and unadorned. They were not resentful. They were factual and solution-oriented. I am joining Horizon Tech as regional director. My priority is continuity for you. Here is the plan we will execute. If you prefer to stay with Alden, we will support that. The tone was an engineer's, precise, calm, and focused on the systems that serve clients. I did not broadcast these messages widely. I sent them personally, with the courtesy of a trusted advisor. Yet people respond to clarity. Within 48 hours, a handful of clients wrote back, some with thanks, some with questions, and a few with clear decisions. A small cluster said they welcomed the continuity and would be open to conversations with Horizon. None of this was a coup. It was a pragmatic ripple. Word traveled faster than we anticipated. A few clients I'd known for years began to arrange calls. They wanted to ensure there would be no sudden drops in service. They wanted to know which faces would continue to show up for them. Those conversations were quiet, professional, and, in the ledger of business, critical. At Alden, the reaction was predictably unnuanced. Internal conversations hardened into strategy memos. Arthur shifted into what he always defaulted to: damage containment. He convened meetings with the board, emailed contingency plans, and made pronouncements about client retention initiatives. He tried to cast the narrative as a leadership challenge rather than as a consequence of people deciding they needed to work in environments where merit was visible. He called me once. No, he sent a message that asked to speak about allegations of poaching. I declined. My priorities were not drama. They were clients and people. Then something happened that surprised even my stoic expectations. A copy of one of my letters, one I'd sent to a key group of clients and to a handful of external partners, made its way into the hands of Arthur's executive assistant. I do not know whether it was a forwarded email or a printed page carried across the office, but the result was the same. Arthur read it in the privacy of his office and did not like what he saw. I arrived at his desk that afternoon on business, professional, a part of my remaining duties, and found him with the letter open in front of him. His response was not immediate. First came the thin flash of curiosity, brows lifting, the quick, mechanical read of someone skimming for spectacle. Then the read slowed. His face rearranged. Curiosity became confusion. Confusion became denial. I watched the arc of it, eyes narrowing, mouth pressing, the fingers that had once patted me on the shoulder now tapping the paper in a rhythm of rising loss of control. "You put clients on notice," he said slowly, like a man trying to parse the scene into a shape he could manipulate. "You told them you're leaving." "I told them what I had decided," I said, "and I offered continuity." He laughed then, a brittle sound. "You told them you'd move the accounts?" "I told them I was moving," I answered. I offered them a plan that served their interest. His reaction moved in stages from disdain to a less controlled anger. The posture he'd cultivated, that poised reserve, cracked as he slammed a hand on his desk and leaned forward. It was, at least in part, because letters are stubborn. They can be filed, forwarded, and archived. A written statement sits in a server and sometimes expands beyond the person who penned it. The one I'd sent had been careful, sterile, professional, but it had also made a tangible decision public in a medium Arthur could not scowl away. "You've jeopardized the numbers," he said. "This will show on the quarterly. You made this personal." "It's been personal for a while," I replied. "But the decision I made was professional. I notified clients so we could manage transitions. That's my responsibility." He scowled, a deeper mar of aging skin that made him look smaller. "You think you can walk out and take them with you?" he hissed. I met his tone with an evenness that felt, to me, earned rather than contrived. I don't take anything that wasn't already in our work. Clients respond to service. You can choose how you respond to that. I chose to be transparent. He folded the letter, and it was the way a man folds a map he no longer recognizes. He picked up his phone and began calling. What he called for, I do not know. Maybe to try to reassure a board member, perhaps to scold his niece, perhaps to instruct damage control. I left his office feeling, oddly, that a kind of accounting was underway. He had read my last letter, and the predictable smirk had been replaced by something less theatrical and more troubling, the recognition that the script no longer belonged to him. In the days that followed, Alden's internal rhythms frayed. Clients asked for meetings. The board asked for updates. We saw, as a firm, the slow and unglamorous slide that comes when talent departs, and leadership is forced to reckon with the inevitability of consequences. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a sober, practical commitment to the work ahead. At Horizon, things moved fast, and with a decisiveness I had not always known at Alden. Marcus trusted the team he had assembled to build product-market fit, and not personalities. Sarah and I restructured the client servicing model in ways that made clear where responsibility and escalation paths lay. We organized calls with transitional teams and created a redundancy of contacts so that no single person's name became the only reason a client stayed. During one of those early transition calls, Daniel Morrison told me plainly, "Amy, we've worked through storms before because you were there. If Horizon gives me the same attention and you're leading it, I'll be there." He did not say it theatrically. He said it as a fact. That factuality was worth more to me than any public pronouncement. As clients made choices, some followed. It was not a mass migration. It was a steady, measured transfer. Arthur called it betrayal when colleagues left, but the colleagues themselves told different stories. Margaret took a position at a smaller regional firm where she would not be footnote to familial hierarchies. Tom found accounting work that respected him as a peer. Where I could, I connected people to opportunities, introductory emails that honored mutual interests rather than opportunistic recruiting. I wanted transitions to be ethical, not predatory. Alden declined incrementally. A lost client here, a woundingly blunt resignation there. My name appeared occasionally in board-level emails as a data point. There were staff cuts in the following quarter, grim business language about efficiencies and alignments. I thought often of the people who would be hit, and my gratitude for the caution I had taken in handovers became sharper. I felt guilt for what I could not prevent, and responsibility for what I could do. Arthur's posture didn't improve. He made one public show of composure after another, but the smirk had been hollowed. The board's patience thinned. Meetings that had once been perfunctory now felt like triage. The man who had once joked about family strength found himself defending choices that looked less like vision and more like preservation of a status quo that clients no longer trusted. Then the invitation came, Alden's annual awards dinner. At first I thought it was to be expected, an awkward, obligatory recognition of long service. I almost did not accept. Joseph argued for attending as an act of closure. "Go," he said. "You can speak if they give you the mic. Besides, people will believe the story they want to. If you're there with your head held, you shape the frame." I bought a new dress, not for spectacle, but because I wanted to look like someone who had walked through a storm and kept her shoulders unclenched. On the night of the dinner, the ballroom smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. The lighting made everyone look slightly cinematic. I arrived with a calm that surprised me, partly because of the life I'd been building at Horizon, and partly because the narrative had already shifted under my feet. Arthur stood at the podium with the practiced posture of a man used to concluding evenings. He spoke of the company's history, career anniversaries, the usual patter of corporate affection, and then, toward the midpoint of the evening, he surprised me and many others. He announced an award, he said, for dedication to the region, and then called my name. The applause felt like a wind that had been redirected. I walked to the stage because leaving it empty would have been its own kind of statement. He presented the Crystal Award, heavy and understated, and smiled in the way men who believe gestures suffice for redress often do. I felt the cameras tilt inward. I felt Lily clapping with gusty, nervous enthusiasm. I felt the prickle of recognition that the room's attention offered. When the microphone came to me, I had rehearsed no flourish. I had written no blistering indictment. I had no interest in theatrics. I wanted to say something that held shape for the people who had worked with me and for the ones who were watching their own thresholds of patience. "Thank you," I said, and the word landed honestly. I appreciate this recognition for the work we did together. I paused because the pause then allowed the room to breathe, to understand I was not there to be used as a prop. "There's a difference between loyalty and servitude," I continued. "Loyalty is mutual. Servitude is one-sided. I hope that as we move forward, we build places where people are invited to contribute and to grow because of merit, not because they fit a family story. The applause was polite, careful. Arthur's eyes flicked toward me in that moment, searching for a crack to exploit. After the speech, there was a small, performative exchange. He approached me and, in a voice meant to be conciliatory, asked if I would consider rejoining Alden now that they had recognized my value in public. I could see the machinery in his expression. The offer would come not as an apology, but as a bargaining chip. I could have accepted. Indeed, had I stayed longer, I might have. But the point of all this was not to secure a seat at his table. It was to be able to make that choice without being boxed by expectation. "No," I said softly, "I won't be returning." It was not a cruel refusal. It was a settled fact. I thanked him for the years of experience and left the rest unsaid. Walking out of that ballroom with the crystal in hand felt like arriving at a conclusion without a fanfare. The award was, I later learned, one Arthur had intended as a symbolic olive branch, an attempt to reclaim narrative. For me, the crystal sat simply as evidence of what work can be recognized when merit is visible. It meant nothing if it could not be carried without shame. Back at Horizon, life continued to be challenging and rewarding in equal measure. I found the satisfaction in the day-to-day, mentoring Sarah, building processes that helped clients rather than finger-pointing, designing onboarding rituals that meant new hires knew their voice mattered. The recognition came in other forms. We retained Morrison. We signed 2 new accounts that had watched the region with a skeptical, market-minded eye. The firm grew, slowly, with the right people in the right places. Time, in corporate life, has the way of smoothing the edges off dramatic moments. Alden's decline continued in slow increments. There were people laid off, some I knew well, others half familiar from late meetings. I felt the complicated grief you feel when structures you depended on dissolve, not just for yourself, but for everyone caught in the remaking. I tried to help where I could. Introductions, references, honest notes explaining a person's strengths. I wanted transitions to be humane. And then, months later, a small piece of office theater completed the circle. I received a parcel at Horizon, a crystal paperweight, not the same as the award, but similar in shape, delivered anonymously. Alongside it was a short note, "For standing steady." There was no signature. I placed it on my new desk beside a framed photo from my first week at Horizon, a team smiling around a whiteboard, markers in hand. Arthur read that letter too. The one I'd sent to clients had been the first, and then there were follow-up notes, polite and procedural. But when I accepted Horizon's offer, and the client confirmations began to appear, emails from people I'd worked with for years affirming continuity, the document that made him lose composure was not merely one of mine. It was an accumulation. My resignation, my client transition letters, the board memos, the client replies, all collated into a dossier that showed, in a way that was unarguable, that the company's assumptions had consequences. When I think of the smirk now, it's not the last word of the story. It was, at the time, a small wound. It spoke of an expectation that I would accept a minor role forever. But his expression when he later read what the letters and replies made plain, that the world would not always play by his private script, was no smirk. It was a face that was not ready for accountability. The victory was not tidy. Some colleagues were hurt, and some bridges were burned. Not everyone landed where I hoped they would. I tried to balance realism with care, and that balance sometimes felt inadequate. But the arc, for me, bent toward something that has always mattered more than applause: dignity. One evening, after a long week of client calls and strategic planning, I came home and set the Crystal Award on the mantel. I placed it beside the small framed photograph from my first week at Horizon Tech. The 2 objects looked like different chapters of the same story. One, the recognition I had once been given in a room that tried to define me. The other, the evidence that I had chosen a different chapter. Joseph sat across from me with a mug of tea. We did not hyperbolize the moment. We did not pretend that everything was fixed. We simply acknowledged the discomfort of growth and the steadying force of partnership. "You did something brave," he said, "not as a flourish, but as a fact in the ledger of our life." "I did what I had to," I replied, "and I learned that some doors are not closed to be mourned, but to be walked toward. There are stories that end with vengeance. Mine does not." The measure of change I sought was not to wound Arthur or to watch the company falter. It was to preserve my sense of self, to create a place where merit is visible, and to extend help to those I could help without compromising my integrity. If there is a final lesson here, for me, it is this. Letting go of the narrative someone else writes for you is not always neat. It can cause tremors in other people's lives. It can be messy and morally ambiguous. But there is something profoundly stabilizing in choosing the terms of your work and the tribe you build around it. The last letter I left on Arthur's desk was not an ultimatum. It was a clear boundary. The other letters, the ones to clients, the offers to colleagues, the small, courteous notes of continuity, were not instruments of retribution. They were tools of stewardship. Sometimes, the best response to a smirk is to keep walking and to build a life that will make the smirk feel more like an artifact than a forecast. In the end, when I place the crystal next to the photo from a new beginning, it feels less like a trophy and more like a map, a reminder of where I started, the choices I made, and the people I wanted to be beside on the way. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been promised something that didn't arrive, or if you're navigating the quiet indignities of a workplace, leave a comment with the moment that mattered most to you. And if you want more stories about dignity, work, and making hard choices, consider subscribing. There are more voices here that remind us we deserve to be seen for our work, not reduced to someone else's convenience.